Welcome, it's Zero9. I'm back with another tutorial. Today we're going to talk about clipping versus limiting. This might be a very controversial subject for some of you because you maybe learned clipping is very bad and you should avoid it at any costs. But the truth is, sometimes it's useful, and now we will check out when it is useful and why it is better and what's actually the difference between clipping and limiting. So let's start. I first want to show you a little picture here. And here we can see a simple sine wave, and we have a soft clipping and a hard limiting mode here, and we are comparing each other. Limiting basically works a little bit different. For example, let's say you're putting in that sine wave into your limiter, and the sine wave is going above the threshold. The limiter will try to reduce the amplitude of that signal so that it's below the threshold. So if you had a perfect limiter, it would only play around with the amplitude of your signal, but the reality is also limiters are not perfect. They will add some kind of distortion or artifacts no matter what. And but the idea behind limiting is so you kind of have a like volume automation similar to a compressor, but they have a hard threshold and nothing can exceed the threshold. Then we have something which is called soft clipping and hard clipping. Most clippers do support soft clipping, so you can set up soft clipping, or you have a dry wet knobs between soft clipping and hard clipping. So you can see soft clipping is not trying to reduce the amplitude of the complete wave. It's only like softening or rounding off the very top above the threshold. And this will also introduce, of course, some distortion, but it's not as hard as hard clipping, because hard clipping is the most extreme setting. So it doesn't change the amplitude of the signal at all. It will only square off everything above the threshold. So let's say you are 3 dB above the threshold. It will really cut it off and leave the rest alone. So it will only touch the signal everything above the threshold, and everything else is untouched here in this example. And that's basically the difference between clipping and limiting. And so now the question probably is, okay, we have limiting, we have clipping, why I should use clipping and why I should use limiting, what's actually better, and what should we use? And the answer is, as always, it depends. It depends very heavily on the source material. So for example, if you have a specific audio file, maybe it's better to limit this file than to clip it, because the limiter just can handle it better. And usually it's like that. If you have very transient heavy material, for example drums, then hard clipping is usually the most transparent and best sounding way to limit, or to kind of limit the audio file. And because if you just square off the transient still hits really hard, and it will add some distortion on top, only on the transient, and that will make the transients often harder than it was in the original file. And with limiting it, because I already told you, limiting will try to reduce the amplitude. It will make the transient softer, and that's on drums, for example, not what we want. So in this example with drums, for example, I would always recommend to try out clipping and see how it works. Usually with clipping, with drums, clipping is more recommended and sounds more transparent and better than limiting, because it does not soften the transient. The transients are very sharp and hard, and the additional distortion is usually not audible because the transients are very short. And clipping is very hard to hear if it's just for a very short period of time. So if you're just clipping a few samples, then it's probably not audible at all. And that's why clipping works better with transient heavy material. And if you have like very sustained sound, then it's better to use a limiter. But I want to encourage you that you really also try it out and see how it compares. So because sometimes a clipper is better than a limiter, or the limiter is better than the clipper. So really try it out and see what works best. And that's what we do now. So let's jump over into Ableton, and I've prepared a little project here with different audio files, and we will run it through different clippers and limiters to see how they compare. And first of all, I've used 2 different clippers in my project. I'm using newfangled audio saturate. And this is a kind of a spectral clipper, so it works a little bit different than just a basic clipper, because it internally processes the signal a little bit. So I think what they do is that they clip the low frequencies a little bit less and clip the higher frequencies a little bit more, because in that way you can make it a little bit cleaner, because clipping low frequencies usually doesn't work that well. But I'm not completely 100% sure what they do internally in the plugin. But the newfangled audio saturate is, in my opinion, is the most cleanest clipper. So if you have like bass heavy material, it performs better than a standard clipper. And so it's kind of in between a limiter and a clipper. It is cleaner than a basic clipper, but not as clean as a limiter. But it's a little bit more punchy and better for transient heavy material than a usual limiter. Then, as a limiter, we have the FabFilter Pro L2, which is one of the best limiters on the market, or it's probably the best limiter on the market. It's really good and transparent. It can handle really a lot of gain reduction, and we will use that one as a comparison to have a really good limiter to compare it with. Then we have the standard clip, which is one of my favorite clippers. You can use different modes here. I've set it to hard clip mode. You can also use soft clip, but soft clip usually has a little bit more distortion in it, so it's often more audible. But for sound design purposes, for example, sometimes this is what you want if you want to add some saturation. But in this case, I will use hard limiting because it's the most transparent. Also a cool algorithm here, by the way, is the ratio 2:1. So it's a kind of compression and limiting altogether. So it's compressing 50% of the signal first, and then the rest is clipped. Sometimes this can be cool, especially on like full mixes or even mastering. I know some mastering engineers using this as well for their mastering process. And I have another instance here of standard clip with exactly the same settings. The only difference is I've used 8 times oversampling here. And if you don't know what oversampling is, or if you want to use clipping and limiting, you should check out my tutorial about oversampling, because it's very important to understand what oversampling does and when to use it, because it can help to improve the audio quality you will get with clipping a lot. And so check it out, and then you should be aware of the process which is done by oversampling. Another short hint maybe, a lot of limiters are also clippers, even if they are not telling you that they are clippers, but they are all, most of the limiters are brick wall limiters. So with a really brick wall the sound at a certain threshold. And if you have a limiter which has a attack setting, then they usually have a clipping instance at the end of the process, even if they are not telling you. Because if you think about it, if you have a text setting, then it will just say, okay, it will take a certain amount of time until the limiter kicks in. So the first milliseconds are here, maybe let's say the first 50 milliseconds of the signal will get through the limiter instance. And then because it's a brick wall limiter, they will have just to square it off at the very end. And that means that a lot of limiters have a clipping stage at the end of the process, even if they're not telling you that they do it, but they do it. So for example, here in this setting, the Pro L2 setting, aggressive, you have some attack here, so it will also clip the signal, but this will help to make the transients hit a little bit harder. But of course, if you have like a simpler limiter where you have no text setting, it might be the case that it's just a limiter without a clipper. But just so that you know, a lot of clippers have a a lot of limiters have a clipping stage at the end of the chain. Alright, I have loaded up different audio samples and we will just check it out. I have loaded up synth sounds, bass sounds, percussion sounds, drum beats, kick loop, heads, whatever. And we will just, I will just flip through the samples, and then I will quickly compare the different instances of clippers and limiters. You will always see here that the chain here, the button here will change. Because I will switch the channels back and forth so you can hear the difference, how the different clippers and limiters compare against each other. And you can really hear that they sound different, and on some sounds one clipper or one limiter is better than the other. So it's really highly dependent on the source material, and that's why you have to try it out to see what works best on specific sounds. One clipper is better than the other, or one limiter is better than the other. Really just check it out yourself at home, and then use the clipper or limiter which sounds best on your specific material. But we will just go through it, and you can see if you can hear the difference. All right, let's start with the first example, a synth loop. Okay, I first have to mention that I'm using a lot of clipping. It's really, I'm smashing it completely. And the reason is that it's easier to hear the difference between the clippers and limiters if you really smash them, because then you kind of hear the characteristics which are added by the clipper or the limiter. And because if I would just drive it 1 or 2 dB, then it's very hard to hear the difference. But if I'm really pushing it here, and so it's very audible how they change the sound. So here in this example, you can clearly hear that the Pro L2 has, of course, less distortion than the clippers. The clippers will add a lot of distortion. The question is always, does it hurt the sound or not? On some sound, it might sound cool. On other sounds, it doesn't. But the limiter here is a lot cleaner than the clippers. But if you compare the sound, the clippers are a lot louder than the limiter, and that's what the extra distortion does, because it adds a lot of distortion. So the overall signal is louder than compared with just the limiter. And we can also try it here on some other loops. Here you can also hear the difference that on a bass loop, it's kind of, you have to really watch out for the distortion, because sometimes if you have just low passed it very much, then the distortion is too audible that it adds on top, and it will get a little bit brighter. But here in this example, you can also hear that the clippers are louder than the limiter, but the limiter is of course again the cleanest one. But you also hear that the newfangled audio clipper is pretty close to the limiter, but it's a little bit louder than the limiter. So it's a kind of in between, because it's a spectral clipper. It doesn't add as much distortion as the standard clip does, but it's still louder than the limiter. And this is an example where you can hear it's a very low passed bass sound, and here the distortion added by the clipper is very audible, and you have to decide if you can live with that or if you don't want that distortion, because then a limiter, for example, in this case, would be a better choice than a clipper. But you can hear that the newfangled audio is still very close to the limiter. But of course the standard clip adds a little bit more distortion. Let's just now try it with more percussive sound, with like short transient. There you can hear the advantages of the clipper, and especially listen for the transient and how hard hitting it is, and really the first part of the transient, how it compares between the limiter and the clipper. So hopefully it's audible on YouTube as well, but you can clearly hear that the clippers, that the transient is a lot harder, and that's because the clipper is not changing the amplitude of the signal. It just squares off the transient, and it will make it even harder because it's adding additional distortion on top of the transient. And here in this example, you can hear that the limiter sounds a little bit softer and not as hard hitting. In this case, for example, I would definitely use the clipper, and I've also compared the standard clip with oversampling and without oversampling. So with oversampling, it's a little bit cleaner, especially in the lower frequencies, and it's still hard hitting. So in this case, I would definitely go with the clipper. In this example, the difference is not too big, so even the limiter handles it very well, and that's because I told you that if you have very transient heavy material and you have some attack on the limiter set, it will also clip it, not limit it, and that's why the sound is different. But still, if you listen closely on the standard clip is still the loudest because it adds more distortion than the newfangled audio one, and also more than the limiter, and so it's the loudest. And still the distortion is not that much of a problem in this example, because the transients are still loud and bright, and so it doesn't hurt it too much. And so if you want the maximum like loudness or perceived loudness, then the clipper will offer a better result here. And this is a very good example that usually with very like bass heavy material, the clippers do not work that well, but you can really hear the difference between the newfangled audio spectral clipper and the standard clipper. So the newfangled audio is a lot cleaner because it internally handles the signal a little bit differently. So for bass heavy material, the newfangled audio clipper is usually better than the standard clip. And in this case, you can also really hear the difference that the limiter is the most cleanest by far. So if you have like sounds like that or very bass heavy material, usually limiting is better than clipping in this case. But let's go to the next example where we have like short transient heavy material again, which is very bright, like a open head, for example. Yeah, here you can also hear the difference a little bit, that the clippers have a little bit of a sharper transient and they're a little bit brighter, but it's really hard hitting. And especially if you have a sample like this, which is already pretty bright, then there's barely any, the distortion is not really audible. And you have to keep in mind that we're using a lot of clipping. In a real case scenario, I would never use that much clipping, but you can see that even with that much clipping, it still sounds okay. And the difference between the limiter and the clipper is not that hard, but still, if you listen closely, the clipper has a little sharper transient than the limiter. And we can use a perk loop. Here the difference is also not that big because the transient is so short that even the Pro L2 will still clip the transient, but the standard clip here, for example, you can still hear that the transient is a little bit harder and brighter. And in a case like this, you can always use the clipper and have a great result. But now let's jump over to a quick real world example how we would use clipping to get more headroom. Because the question, of course, might be, okay, why do we have to use limiting or clipping at all? And this is a good question, because the answer is we have to use it because nowadays, especially bass heavy electronic dance music is very loud, and the final masters are very loud volume. And we have to use a lot of limiting and compression to get at that volume level. And that's why it's important that the crest factor of your mix is not too high, so you don't have a lot of peaks, because then the mastering engineer has a lot of problems to make it loud, because all those peaks are hitting the limiter, and then the limiter has to work really hard to make it loud. And that's why we try to keep the crest factor lower, so that the mix is not super dynamic. It's a little bit like flatter, but that makes it a lot easier to make the mix very loud. And if you use clipping, for example, on like drum sounds, you can still have a pretty like sharp and hard hitting sound with less headroom, without making the sound too soft. That's usually what happens if you use, for example, a limiter on these sounds. Then it will reduce the dynamic range, and then the biggest problem of reducing dynamic range is that, for example, the drums are not hitting as hard. But a limiter is kind of in between that. You still get the headroom, but the transients are still crisp and clear and hard hitting. And that's what we're trying to achieve. And sometimes the range in which the clipper works well is very small, so you have to know what you're doing. But for example, if you're just clipping like 2 or 3 dB, then in most cases it's not really audible, but still you get some additional headroom, and this will help you a lot in the final mastering stage. Here I've prepared just a few like sounds, a kick, head, a clap, and synth sounds, and so you can hear it. And in this example, we don't have any clipping on the individual channels and no clipping on the bus. We have just the Pro L2 loaded, and we will just push it a little bit into the limiter. And so the limiter has to do all the work. This is the case, for example, if we use no clipping at all, then the limiter has to do all the work. It has to clamp down on all the peaks. You can just take a little listen. For example, in this case, we have to limit it around -3.5 dB, and the limiter has to take care of all the peaks in the signal. All right, and then we have the same sounds on another group, and this time we're using clipping on all the individual sounds to just square off the transient a little bit, so that the final limiter does not work as hard. I'm using standard clip here. Let's see. All right, here you can see that the difference is not that much. The sound is pretty much the same, and we're clipping like 2 or 3 dB. And using hard clip mode, we can also see it here in the meter. We'll play it without the clipper. And now with. So we're gaining about a little bit above 2 dB of headroom by clipping the sound, and it doesn't change the sound too much. It still sounds good and pretty much the same as the original sound, but we gain 2 dB of headroom. And the same on the clap. You can also hear the difference is very little, and let's see how much headroom we're getting here. Also a little bit about 2 dB of headroom, and the sound is pretty much the same. And here on the synth as well. So you can see we're only like squaring off the very top and the transients. Let's see how much, or we can compare it afterwards. So here you can see that it's barely audible, the difference between the with the clipper on and off, but we are getting about 4 dB of headroom, which is a lot. And now if we sum all these signals together, we can use an additional clipper, which is clipping the bus and gets the peaks there. So you can see also it's barely noticeable, the difference, and it just gets maybe another half or 1 dB of headroom, and then we can hit the final limiter with the same setting as on the other group. And here you can see we are probably 2 dB, we have 2 dB less gain reduction here. So we have saved up some headroom for the final limiter. And so the limiter has not to work as hard, but still the sounds sound pretty much the same as without clipping. It's always like, yeah, you have to think about it. Can I live with a little bit of distortion? I add on the sounds, but in return you get some headroom, and sometimes then because you gain some headroom, the final result will sound better, because otherwise if you wouldn't have that headroom, the limiter has to work so hard that the limiter introduces more distortion and will soften your transient, that the result with only the limiter sounds worse than if you use a little bit of clipping and have additional headroom, and your final limiter has just to reduce to a 3 dB here. And we can also compare the different results, and I'm not sure if it's audible on YouTube. Make sure to have the highest quality settings, and try to listen especially how the kick sounds in the mix and how the transient sounds in the mix, and let's see if you can hear the difference. So at least here I can hear the difference, that if you listen to the mix, and especially like the kick is hitting a little bit harder on the example where we use clipping to get some gain reduction, because it's not hitting the final limiter as hard. So we gain the headroom there, and the final limiter doesn't have to do as much work. And that's why the transient of the kick sounds a little better, and the complete mix is a little bit more focused, because on the other example with no clipping, you can hear that when the limiter pushes down everything, you can hear that it gets a little bit like muddy, and everything is going down. And On the example with clipping, it's a little bit more focused and more tighter. Everything is like in place, and that's due to the final limiter having to do less work. And basically that's what we want to achieve with using clipping on early stages. So to clip individual channels, we are clipping like buses or subgroups, and that's where limiting clipping can really help. You have just to understand when to use clipping and when to use limiting. And on some sounds clipping is better, and on some sounds limiting is better. But I think I've showed you a few examples where you can really hear that clipping is not as bad as some people pretend it to be. And especially on transient heavy sounds like drum sounds, percussive like sounds, or very short synth sounds, also like plug sounds, that you can get away with a lot of clipping without being really audible. And the advantage is you gain a lot of headroom, and the sound is pretty much the same, but you gain 2, 3, 4 dB of headroom. And if you add that up over all your individual channels and subgroups, you can really save a lot of headroom, and the final limiter has just to push it 2 or 3 dB to get to your target loudness level. And that's probably what we will do with all the clipping and limiting. So just try it out in your own project. It takes some time to really get it, how it works and where you have to use it. But once you accomplish that, it can be really helpful, especially if you're struggling getting your final mix at a certain volume level or at a professional volume level. So just try it out. Also watch my oversampling video if you want to use clipping. And if you have any questions, put it down in the comments. I will check them out. If you liked that video, leave a like and subscribe. See you in the next tutorial. Have a nice day. Ciao. Bye-bye.